Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Pia Oberoi and I represent the UN Human Rights Office based here in Bangkok as the Senior Advisor on Migration and Human Rights. I'd like to welcome you to today's session of the Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum on Confronting Hate and Disinformation through Ethical Advertising. Together we can. The session is being organized by the UN Human Rights Office and our partners in the Conscious Advertising Network, CAN. Our session today will aim in broad strokes to answer two related questions. Firstly, what is or are the human rights concerns raised in the context of advertising today? And secondly, what is or are the solutions? In response to the first question, you will hear the issue as seen from the vantage point of human rights actors, and also as seen by advertisers and companies. Although there may be nuances, you will also hear a commonality of purpose, a desire to look at the issue through the lens of a big tent, and a determination to showcase practices that work. To the second question, speakers will outline solutions that lie both in the regulatory realm, particularly in terms of the technological and programmatic aspects of how advertising works today, as well as in the realm of narrative change, creating an enabling environment and vision for society, ensuring meaningful and diverse representation in advertising. Before I hand over to our distinguished speakers, a few words on the interest of the UN Human Rights Office in this topic, and particularly why we are excited to bring this conversation to the Asia-Pacific region. Our meeting today follows many previous discussions with our partners at CAN at the global level on how to bring human rights standards and guidance to the attention and interest of the world of advertising and marketing. This has been a dialogue of building mutual trust and understanding, learning each other's language, and seeking to identify entry points into each other's worlds. Our message is that human rights law and standards provide benchmarks and parameters for regulation, whether this comes in the form of legislative requirements or voluntary industry initiatives such as the CAN manifestos. At the same time, we are aware that this topic as a whole calls up new areas of human rights inquiry, the parameters of hateful speech, for example, or due diligence in the impact of algorithmic advertising. And to address these successfully, we also need meaningful partnerships. Over recent years, and increasingly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also in the context of the climate emergency, OHCHR has had rising concerns that xenophobia, racism, religious hatred, anti-migrant narratives, disinformation, and other content inciting hatred against people has flourished on social and traditional media platforms, as has the continued proliferation of business models that profit from spreading hate and disinformation. Seen from the particular perspective of migrants' human rights, it is important to recall the pervasive and disproportionate impact of such hate and disinformation on groups who already live vulnerable and marginalized lives in their countries of transit and destination. In this region and in others, we have and continue to see the scapegoating of migrants and other minorities as an easy win for those who seek profit or advantage from doing so. Through our work on narrative change on migration, OHCHR is also keen to support a broad conversation on how we can work together with partners in the private sector and in civil society to paint a picture of the communities we want to live in, moving away from a constant rebuttal of who we are not to showcasing who we are. This is also a foundational aspect of the prevention agenda that is so fundamental to the United Nations and speaks to the SDG agenda imperative to leave no one behind, to interrogate the kind of invisibility that marginalizes migrants and leaves them vulnerable to the pernicious effects of hate speech and disinformation. My question would be, in ongoing or future attempts to enhance representation in advertising, are we seeing undocumented migrants and other marginalized communities in the mirror held up by advertising? We cannot be satisfied with our efforts until this mirror represents society in all its diversity. And finally, we at OHCHR are interested to ground this conversation in the realities of the Asia-Pacific region. How do we contextualize and understand the local context? Who are the actors? Which are areas of particular concern? For example, in respect of widespread official disregard for the right to freedom of expression in many countries in this region. How do we battle hate speech and disinformation? Do companies invest resources to understand this context and apply safeguarding policies consistently across jurisdictions? Can we grow CAN in Asia and the Pacific? Our ultimate aim is to build and nurture multi-stakeholder dialogue and partnerships, and to ground them in local realities in order to uphold human rights. To debate these issues and more, we have for you today a panel of speakers who are not only hugely distinguished in their own fields, but cumulatively represent this unique partnership between brands, advertisers, and civil society. And I'm very excited to introduce you to them today. And I'll do that as they speak. We also look forward to the audience's active participation in our discussion, so please write your questions in the Q&A chat box as they come to you. But first, however, I would like to give the floor for our keynote address to Mr. Fernand de Verheyen, the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. Mr. de Verheyen assumed his functions on the 1st of August 2017, and his mandate has recently presented a report to the Human Rights Council in which he addresses the widespread targeting of minorities through hate speech in social media. The Special Rapporteur has extensive expertise on the human rights of minorities, as well as the prevention of ethnic conflicts, the rights of migrants, and the relationship between ethnicity, human rights, and democracy. Mr. Special Rapporteur, you have the floor.
Thank you, Pia. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. First, please allow me to thank the co-organizers of this UN Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum for Asia Pacific and the Regional Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Conscious Advertising Network for the honor of joining all of you here, at least virtually, from different parts of the world, and to consider how responsible businesses could, through ethical advertising, confront hate and disinformation with the rather catchy slogan, together we can. But how can we really? And what are we trying to address? To promote an inclusive narrative, one must first understand what we're dealing with. So please allow me, therefore, to be rather blunt as to what we're confronting today by setting part of the context of the challenges the world is facing right now. Hate speech and disinformation are creating the fertile ground for what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described in the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech in the following way, and I quote, "Around the world, we're seeing a disturbing groundswell of xenophobia, racism, and intolerance. Public discourse is being weaponized for political gain with incendiary rhetoric that stigmatizes and dehumanizes minorities, migrants, refugees, women, and any so-called other." But there's one thing, hate is not new, but the scale and speed of it in more recent years through social media is. In most countries where we do have reliable data that has been disaggregated, it seems that even perhaps more than 3/4 of hate speech targets minorities. And that means also migrants in most cases. We have situations which are well known, for example, involving the Baha'is as targets of hate speech, against Roma, mainly in Europe, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, hate against Dalits or Asians or migrants of color, and those who are different from the majority. As a reminder, if we needed a reminder, the Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It started with hate speech against a minority. And the promise of never again seems feeble as the horrific head of even genocidal actions rears again against minorities recently, such as the Rohingya of Myanmar, of course, a religious and ethnic minority. This is a global trend. What has changed, however, is which we have not adapted sufficiently, is the speed and spread of persecution, which can be fueled like steroids by the tsunami of hate speech in social and other media as it enters the atmosphere. And it makes prejudice and intolerance almost acceptable. And let's be honest, it can prepare the terrain and normalize persecution of certain minorities and atrocities being committed against minorities, attacks against migrants, and so on. And therefore, we have an environment that encourages blaming the others and scapegoating of minorities and migrants. Now, unfortunately, the responses of the international community remains, well, let's just say, resolutely analog while facing messages of hate on steroids, targeting minorities and migrants in the digital world of social media. So if we need reminding, again, there are also increased risks of violence and atrocities committed against minorities and migrants in Asia Pacific. There are many examples that you're aware of, but also around the world, and even conflicts that actually have hate as the fuel. And there is, unfortunately, at times a reluctance to highlight who are the main victims and targets here. So let me repeat, this pandemic of hate and disinformation is being spewed mainly through private social media platforms. These are private businesses, businesses whose business model depend to a significant extent on the financial support of advertisers, of course, and the profits that they make from that, and also data mining and so on. So the reality today is that you have a handful of large companies operating on models that tend to exacerbate the polarizing views of certain views in society and fueling, unfortunately, through hate and disinformation, exclusionary extremes of xenophobia, intolerance, nationalist views that target largely minorities and migrants in all parts of the world faster than the speed of light through social media platforms. Hate speech can, in some cases, must be prohibited. And here, I think it's increasingly becoming evident that there may be the need for the adoption of global legislation or a global framework in order to ensure that the responsibilities of social media platforms to avoid real harm caused by hate is respected. In other words, there are responsibilities that need to be recognized in relation to media. Advertisers actually can have a huge impact because they can affect on what is profitable. So what is needed is a message of unity, hope, justice, and change. A message that we're all actually aware of, or in many cases, we should be aware that we can actually promote a much more inclusive narrative where we're sensitive to, and we try to deal with the disinformation and hate, which target mainly migrants and minorities. We need, or rather, migrants, minorities, those who are the targets of hate and disinformation, don't need special treatment, but they need dignity, equality, and respect. And that's what we need to hear right now. But that's not what the business models of social media tends to focus and direct to. Advertising provides some of the tools to address these challenges. And let me mention very quickly some practices which illustrate the direction that needs to be considered, perhaps. I'm not sure how many of us remember, but we're actually celebrating this year the 40th anniversary of and I shall name the company, the Coca-Cola commercial, which involved a song or a jingle, which some of you will immediately recognize the name. I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony, which started airing on radio and television ads in 1971. There are a whole generation of listeners and viewers who still remember and can sing actually the first lines of that song. I won't do that, rest assured. The popularity of the jingle even led to a full-length song dropping references to Coca-Cola at the time. So the song became a hit record in the US and the UK and other countries also. And the finished product featured on TV featured a multicultural group of young people lip singing the song in a hill outside Rome, Italy. The global unity of the singers is emphasized by showing also the product they are holding, are labeled in a variety of languages. And as a little side story, not everyone was delighted at the time. The then apartheid regime of South Africa asked that a version be made without any black singers. Coca-Cola refused. The product, that jingle, that advertisement, has been described by one magazine as one of the best loved and most influential ads in TV history. In 2000, Channel 4 and the Sunday Times in the UK ranked what began as an advertisement jingle as the 16th in the 100 greatest TV ads, and ITV in 2005 ranked it 10th in its list of the greatest advertisements of all time. So the idea of all of us, even those who are others, united in our diversity and differences, but still all equal and part of the same human family, that many of us still remember even 40 years later, shows the possible potential power of advertising. But advertising that celebrates these differences and diversity, including minorities, migrants, and others. And this is the powerful message which can be spread and spread around rights-based and ethical advertising practices. So if we needed a reminder, with over $600 billion spent on advertising globally every year, advertising provides the fuel for traditional and social media platforms. And we can use that fuel to perhaps address xenophobia, racism, religious hatred, and anti-migrant narratives by discouraging, if you will, the misinformation and other content that incites hatred against people who are different. So we could do, the advertising world could do so much more and better. And the private sector needs to consider its role tackling the economics of hate with a different message and a different narrative. Can we sing in harmony? Well, yes, we can. But to do that, we actually have to provide a positive image, an alternative image that takes into account freedom of expression, but also the need to prohibit certain forms of hate and to legislate internationally and nationally if needed. Merci, shukran, shukriya, gracias.
Very much, Special Rapporteur. Thank you for a very inspiring keynote, despite the lack of jingles, I have to say. But it was very inspiring and important to hear you put so clearly what is at stake, why we're having this conversation, and to really showcase at the forefront the minorities, the migrant groups, the people that are invisible, that need to have that voice, that need to be centered in this conversation, and through representation as well. And I'm sure as we hear from our other speakers, we'll hear about ideas of how representation can be meaningful in a way that is impactful from the example that you shared. And thank you also for bringing up, kind of various innovative ideas around regulation and what is needed now, because you're right, hate is not new. Hate, we've always unfortunately had hate in our human societies, but we have a new iteration of how that hate is being spread, and we need new tools. And I think part of the conversation that we're having in these kinds of settings is really to think about where those new tools are. So thank you again, Special Rapporteur, and it was an inspiring keynote. I'm now going to turn to Mr. Jake Dubbins, who is the co-founder of the Conscious Advertising Network, and so the co-organizer of this session today. In his day job, Jake is managing director of Media Bounty, which is a leading independent, ethical, creative and media agency. Jake is going to introduce us to the Conscious Advertising Network and to the world of advertising more generally, and help us start to understand, those of us in the human rights world, where the conversation can start with advertisers and marketers. Jake, please.
Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody listening in. I'm hoping to share a presentation with you to walk you through the world of advertising, how advertising now works in 2021, and the intersection between advertising and human rights. So I will whistle through this presentation. There's plenty of examples and how some of these examples impact the Asia Pacific region as well. So Firstly, we're going to go through an introduction to digital advertising, where it can go wrong, and then a case study for where we were involved in something called the UN Global Compact for migration. And then after myself, we'll also explore the solutions from CAN, from the WFA, who are joining today as well, and from events, or rather initiatives like the Unstereotype Alliance. So firstly, a quick crash course in digital or programmatic advertising. It's changed a lot over the past few decades. So it used to be a human buying space in a newspaper between television programs from another human. But now a lot of this has been automated by robots and machine learning, both online and increasingly in platforms like out of home and on TV, so addressable and connected TV. So the changes really meant that when everybody here looks at a news story or on your social media account, it's not advertisers themselves that make the decision of when to show you the ad. It is the systems, the advertising technology platforms in between that decide to show you that ad. And that's really based on your personality traits, your browsing behaviors, and also people with similar behaviors. So largely advertisers are using the data that we share freely on the internet to target you with messages, on the platforms that you're used to being on. So what that means actually in practice is that, sorry, this is meant to come through. So an advertiser like Amazon would place a bid on something called a DSP, which is a demand side platform. So they'd bid to place an ad. In between all of this, there is a digital marketplace for advertisers and publishers. It's effectively a trading floor, a global trading floor. And then that ad is then placed by the supply side platform, eventually at the publisher. So there's a huge amount of players through this whole program. It's no longer an advertiser saying, I want to show my words and pictures on this TV show. It goes through a very complicated, and some might say efficient, or some others might say opaque system to show you those ads. But it is very, very complicated. So this is, just a snapshot of the Asia Pacific marketing technology landscape. It is very complex. There are a lot of people within this this arena, and effectively, all we're really doing is showing words and pictures to people. But it goes through a number of different stages to get there. So, as the Special Rapporteur rightly said, advertising fuels the internet. Without advertising, we don't have Google, we don't have Facebook, we don't have a lot of the platforms that we all are on. We don't actually have a lot of the media. And Special Rapporteur said that 600 odd billion is spent on advertising. Half of that is on digital advertising. So last year it was estimated that 332 billion was spent on digital advertising. But obviously with that 330 billion, with such great power, comes great responsibility. And so with the Conscious Advertising Network, what we've tried to do is put together a voluntary coalition, to Pia's point, a big tent of over 125 organizations trying to help the ethics catch up with the technology of modern advertising. And that ranges, the members range from big advertisers like GSK, Jerry's organization, to O2, Telefonica, for example, Havas Media, Group M, to Accenture as well. But also the critical thing is the partnership between business and those that are working on the front line. So affected communities, NGOs, the civil society groups that help us define the problem a lot better than we as advertisers can do in our advertising bubble. So just a quick snapshot of what we're trying to do. We look across 6 manifestos: misinformation, hate speech, fraud, diversity and inclusion, children's well-being, and informed consent. I'll talk to you a little bit about hate speech and misinformation and where it does go wrong, and then obviously other panelists will move on to talk about what are the solutions. So very quickly, it's both a moral and a commercial imperative for advertisers. A conservative estimate says that $235 million in revenue is generated annually from ads running on extremist and disinformation websites. The special rapporteur talked about the economics of hate. This is a business model. This is a business model that is earning money through advertising. To give you an example, and yes, this is from Europe and North America, but I want to show you how this then impacts the online harm, impacts real world harm in places like Asia Pacific. So the Great Replacement is a conspiracy theory that states that with the complicity of replacist elites, that includes in their narrative people like the United Nations, white populations are being deliberately replaced by migrants, so non-European peoples. There is a group called Generation Identity. After the Christchurch terrorist atrocity, where 51 Muslims lost their life in Christchurch, this group held a protest calling for remigration and de-Islamization. Remigration actually means the deporting of non-white populations from Northern European countries and Northern American countries. Now, this is the person that is behind this organization, Martin Sellner, and he had very close links to the terrorist in Christchurch. Now, his messages were being spread across various social media platforms. So this is him talking on YouTube. And unfortunately, at that time, this is no longer the case, but advertising is supporting this content. Advertising is literally funding this content. So where I was talking about earlier, Peloton they don't want to be funding this stuff, but because this ad is placed by the ad tech platforms in between and the robots and the machines that we talked about, they end up being on this content, which means that they are actively not just that their brand is next to this content, they're actually then funding this person and this organization. So like we said earlier, it's an economic model. I talked about the great replacement. The New Zealand mosque shooting, his manifesto was called The Great Replacement. So the conspiracy theories and the narratives that we see online inspire this sort of real world harm in places, very far away from where a lot of these conspiracy theories are being used. A quick case study, and this is something Pia will be very familiar with. We came to the United Nations General Assembly at the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and presented to the General Assembly. In the lead up to that, we were looking at a lot of the conspiracy theories being spread. And actually, recently, looking back at this, a Spanish organization called Alto found nearly 50,000 Twitter users tweeting conspiracy theories about this event, taking extremist content from websites and using images, linking across borders. So again, this is organized stuff. In the lead up to the event, we did our research and typing in UN Global Compact for Migration. It wasn't mainstream narratives or narratives about the event from the UN. It was pretty much all far-right organizations, nationalist organizations, talking about this. And unsurprisingly, at that time, it was all monetized and supported by advertising. So again, it's the money that is paying for this sort of content. I'll just give you one quick example. Rebel Media were one of those organizations undermining this, what they won't tell you about the UN Global Compact for Migration. And just to give you a quick insight of to who these people are, one of them, a man called Tommy Robinson, who talked about Muslims in these ways in 2019 and was removed from Facebook and other social media platforms. Another correspondent, the founder of the Proud Boys, Gavin McGuinness, who talked about Jews in this way on Rebel Media. And also Katie Hopkins, who in the Sun newspaper in 2015, so a long time ago, but talked about migrants in dehumanizing language, calling them cockroaches. So those are the sorts of reporters on Rebel Media. Rebel Media, so this was just one example. Now, what actually then happened is multiple countries pulled out of that. The US pulled out of the Global Compact. The Belgian government collapsed, and Brazil also pulled out. There were multiple countries that ended up pulling out because of this sort of misinformation. So from a political point of view, that's what can happen. But on the barrel of the Christchurch terrorist's gun, he scrawled this: "Here's your migration compact," on his actual gun that he used in that terrorist atrocity. And so he was inspired by these narratives and by this misinformation and hate that we see online. So like I said, it inspires real world violence, but it's happening now too. That was a couple of years ago. This is my militia in the US that were organizing the far right insurrection on the Capitol on January the 6th. Again, up until recently, big brands were advertising on this, not because they want to, but because that's where they're being placed. And again, the special rapporteur said that the Holocaust did not start with the gas chambers. This T-shirt on the right from the Proud Boys, for those of you who don't know, means 6 million wasn't enough. So, we think the same could happen to other events, and like the climate conference in COP26. I've been joined by my daughter. my daughter's joined. Don't know. Blue. Try that. Yeah. Okay. And so, so yes, I'm nearly finished, by the way. So my daughter might come back again. So we're seeing a big increase in the in climate denial over the past few months. Our partners at the Global Disinformation Index are seeing quite a big spike in climate denial narratives and engagement on climate denial. And we're also seeing some messages being tested on some of the platforms as well, saying that climate change is a hoax, for example, and also that global warming doesn't exist. And again, the same incidents again. Big brands are again sponsoring this sort of stuff again. So yeah, we also have seen that the start of back to the migration issue. Some of those actors, some of the far right actors that undermine these sorts of things, are starting to talk about climate migrants and climate migration, not in a positive way. Thank you very much. That's all for me. So our ultimate goal is for the Conscious Advertising Network is for advertisers to incorporate the principles of our manifestos into their supply chain. Ultimately, it's the responsibility of the advertisers. It is their money, and we encourage advertisers to adopt the manifestos, but also really lean into people like the WFA and their work with the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. And any attempt to clean up this supply chain. Ultimately, hate and misinformation is an economic model. People are free to say what they like within the law, but they have no right to be paid. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation and appreciate the opportunity to organise this with Pia and the team at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Thank you very much, Jake, and thank you, as usual, for a really entertaining and interesting presentation. I'm sorry I didn't get to see your daughter, but maybe she'll wander by later. I think it's important, the point that you made about the inadvertent fueling of hate, because I think the point that you made about the complexity of the ecosystem, and it's definitely news for those of us that don't work in the industry, but I'm sure within the industry as well, there's kind of the range of complexities that are there. The idea that this is a conscious choice, that you make conscious choices about where these ads are placed, etc., is not always true. So I think, as you say, the choices that can be made, there should be that choice. But what we're trying to do is bring more light, bring more information into the picture, bring the standards of human rights, the benchmarks and parameters that are provided to help the advertising industry. and to make conscious choices about what they do and where they advertise. So thank you for helping us join some of these dots. And I'll turn now to Jerry Dakin, who will also, I think, kind of lead us down that road of understanding more the issues that we're talking about today. Jerry leads paid advertising across GSK Consumer Healthcare's EMEA region. He also leads their global internal diversity and representation in marketing initiative, while externally he champions representation as co-chair of the WFA Diversity Task Force and is a voluntary director at Advertising and, of course, the Conscious Advertising Network. Jerry, I'm delighted that you could join us today. Please go ahead.
And thank you very much for having me. It's a real honour to be able to address this audience and to, as the speakers before me have said, to try and lift this conversation up and move it forward. He did a wonderful job of explaining I wear a few different hats, but I guess ultimately I'm here to try and bring a brand voice to show as an advertiser, as a marketer, what some of our perspective on that is. And you'll hear from a couple of us and also the World Federation of Advertisers today. So apologies for some similarities, some overlap, but I think it's important to bring this to life for some different perspectives. If you don't know GSK Consumer Healthcare, we're a big global consumer healthcare business, part of a wider pharmaceutical company with brands like Sensodyne, Panadol, Advil, Eno, Otrivin. You may well use yourselves right across the Asia Pacific region. I also volunteer at the Conscious Advertising Network, which brings me here today, and also with the World Federation of Advertisers. So this topic of sort of having a passion for diversity, for inclusion, for sustainability, and ultimately to challenge our marketing industry to do better is something that's really close to my heart. And I think broadly within the wider advertising industry, certainly this topic of diversity and inclusion, no doubt spurred on by some recent events, some of the context Jake mentioned, global moments like the Black Lives Matter movement have certainly put a pressure on the industry to kind of consider what its role is in that. We look internally first. I think as an industry we are far from being as diverse and as inclusive as we need to be. There's a lot of work to be done then. We also look, and a great example from many years ago from Coca-Cola that the Special Raconteur mentioned, but we look at the content we produce, the marketing we produce. Advertisers have billions and billions of touch points with consumers around the world. Are we using those positively to break stereotypes, to unstereotype content, to truly represent consumers, or are we often, unfortunately, doubling down on stereotypes? Do we show women as housewives all the time? Do we show less of some of the ethnic minorities that exist within our countries, within our markets? So there's a real challenge that we need to do better there. And then there's this topic that is a key part of what we're talking today, which is our media spends, our actual advertising, where we spend money, whether it's on TV, on Facebook, on display, those banner adverts you see around the internet. We need to understand that also has a role in this space. And that's actually, I'm sure for many of you in this forum, this is quite new to you. Even within the marketing world, this sense that we have a conscious responsibility with our advertising and our media spend is quite new for us as well. I think people don't always think in that way, and it's a new muscle we're trying to encourage people to think. So as marketers, in my day job, I spend very little of my time, I'll be honest, thinking about human rights issues. And I'm sure most of you joining this forum today spend even less of your time thinking about programmatic advertising, which is that clever computer-controlled advertising Jake was simplifying a bit earlier. So it's definitely bringing different communities together. And I think that's why this is such a powerful forum. For us, as one business within that, we spend over £1.5 billion on paid media advertising globally. So even as one entity within that world, we can fund a lot of good things, or if we're not careful, a lot of bad things. I like to think we do fund a lot of good things: journalism, positive content, a lot of the TV we watch, a lot of the great internet sites. Although, of course, social media platforms have their challenges, they've also been responsible for some great human rights progress and movements. And a lot of that is advertising funded. But I think a key message that I'll echo that Jake said is there is a lot of complexity here. you might say unnecessary complexity, and I think there's definitely a role that we as an industry need to do to simplify things. But within my own company, we have over 1,000 marketers. Within my own region of the Europe, Middle East and Africa, we have over 300 people working at our media agency trying to buy and plan and work what advertising we need to buy. Yes, there are big platforms like Facebook and Google, which have huge responsibility and impact in this space. And across the board, we need to hold those partners even more accountable than they are. But there's also this really long tail of websites. Sometimes big advertising campaigns can appear on over 100,000 different websites. So, you get to a point where it's far too many for a human to have picked all those sites, and also potentially far too many for a human to even check what all those websites were. That's where some of this risk comes in. Now, of course, there are things we can do to be much more limited in where we appear, what we feature on. We could make sure we only appeared on some of the biggest, most well-known websites. But there are risks with that as well. It's important that we fund a broad perspective of views. We want minority opinions, diverse voices, small emerging news channels and local reporting to be funded. We want a healthy ecosystem that isn't just big global platforms or dominant media sites having all of our money. We want to make sure we reach broad and diverse audiences, and therefore it's not always as simple as being able to say we can just cut off that long list of sites. We need to find a way to approach it. And so to try and build on what Jake was saying, I wanted to bring to life just a few of the things that practically as advertisers we are doing, and again echoing that there's much more that needs to be done. But one of the things we at GSK do, we're part of the Conscious Advertising Network. We're also part of the World Federation and something they have called the Global Alliance of Responsible Media that Ranji might touch on. We are actively part of a global conversation to challenge platforms and move the industry forward. I think coming to a forum like this and being able to speak to the United Nations about it is a key part of that. And don't underestimate the power and the brand that the UN has. When we had a similar session in Geneva 18 months or 2 years ago, and when we came back to the marketing industry and shared our experiences there, it was hugely impactful for people to realize, wow, this stuff really echoes on a global stage. What's our role within it? The big thing that brands do try and do is something that we would broadly call brand safety. That's the steps we take to try and avoid some of the terrible things Jake shared. Without getting really complicated, there's basically a range of technology partners that can help us with that. Often it uses long keyword lists where you have long lists of exclusion words where you say as an advertiser, I won't appear alongside any content that mentions these words. Technology is evolving, approaches are evolving. That's getting better and more sophisticated. Because again, you have to be careful. You might want to block obviously you want to block hate speech against minorities, but if you do that in a very broad way, you accidentally block all positive journalism, all positive coverage of that same audience. So we have to find very careful ways of approaching that. We have to make sure that as we protect against the worst stuff, we don't accidentally defund the good stuff. And actually, for me, one of the biggest opportunities here that I'm really encouraging more marketers to jump on is deliberate and positive inclusion. So don't just think about how you exclude the worst parts, though absolutely we have to do that as an industry. Think about how we deliberately include the good parts. How do we absolutely make sure that our media spends are reaching and funding diverse voices, quality journalism, high quality entertainment, the kind of things we would be proud of as marketers to invest in. And for us, that sometimes means individual partners with local news companies, local diverse owned and operated media companies. Sometimes it means within that computer controlled programmatic advertising, building out networks and sets of many smaller companies where we try and make sure our media does get there. So there is lots being done, but those approaches are flawed. They're not perfect yet. There's work to be done as an industry to get better at that, and there's definitely work to be done to encourage more advertisers to have stronger and stricter settings in those places. Just to conclude, Pierre also mentioned that one of my hats I get to wear is an internal job at GSK where I drive our representation and diversity in marketing initiative. And that is very much coming back to our content, our suppliers and our media, the entire mix. How do we make sure our marketing mix is truly representative. And for us, that has particularly means a lot of our content. And so we've been training all 1,000 plus of our marketers will go through training this year around bias, around the need to have positive inclusion in our advertising. And we're really pushing our marketers that as we create content, as we create marketing, we need to not just think about average people or perfect people or the sort of maybe the traditional stereotypes you've seen in marketing. We absolutely also need to feature the true diversity of our consumers, whether that's racial, gender, LGBT, whether that's age, class, many different functions of consumers. And for us as a personally and for us as a business, it's really important that our advertising does do that. We're a healthcare company. We believe in total healthcare for all humans, and that means truly representing and serving our consumers. So yeah, just to echo what Jake has said, there's a real challenge here that emerged from some of the complexity about modern marketing. Many brands are trying to tackle that, but we absolutely need to do more. And we really welcome the partnership of influential organizations like the UN in raising that agenda and helping us do so. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for being so eloquent as usual. I won't make the mistake I made in Geneva of trying to summarize or kind of encapsulate what you said. But what really struck me was the call to make efforts to include the good stuff, because I think that that's exactly where we want to go. We need to recognize the bad stuff, and certainly from the human rights side, we're here to help you kind of disentangle, disaggregate, where the harm can happen. But in a sense, we need you to lead the charge of doing what you guys do, which is to showcase, the best and the most diverse. And so, I think it's, thank you for setting out some solutions. I know that the colleagues that follow will also pick up on some of these aspects and run with them. But thank you for really, you and Jake for really kind of setting our session in good hands and on a good footing in this very complex topic that we're looking at. Thank you again. Next, we have Ruchira Jetli, who leads product portfolio planning, marketing, and go-to-market for India with HMD Global, which is a Finnish startup. A B2C business and marketing professional for the past 23 years, Ruchira was responsible for building some of the biggest brands for PepsiCo in India, for harnessing India-led innovations and leveraging global playbooks to bring alive brands from Pepsi, 7-Up, Mountain Dew, and Mirinda to Lay's and Cheetos. And before I give you the floor, I just want to say that my son particularly would be delighted at the list of products that you've been responsible for. But I know that you'll also be able to speak very passionately and personally to the situation of your brand and how to take marketing forward in the country context in India. So please, Ruchira, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Pia. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to this forum and being a part of this panel. And I do agree, by the way, with Fernand about the message that Coke put out. As much as they were competitors for me in my earlier role, it is something that as a marketer and as a business owner, it is of huge importance to us. Let me start out by really talking about what we're going through today and the perspective that I'd like to bring to this panel. We're in the midst of what one would say once in a lifetime pandemic, and I truly hope it's a once in a lifetime pandemic. The scale and the global ramifications of this are sure to be very long lasting. And equally, we are debating today how this shall shape the future, whether as a business, as a marketer, as a society, right? And the currency that's being traded across countries today, the most today, is trust. There is a huge trust vacuum in a lot of countries across the world. What, who, how do we trust? And bear with me when I come to the point, because when we talk about one industry, which is at the heart of connecting all of us today, and equally at the heart of this debate, it's technology, really. And social media in particular, as pointed out earlier by some of my colleagues on this panel. Because in my country, one could argue that at the peak of the second wave, which was just about 3 weeks ago, And I think a lot of us saw the kind of devastation it brought for so many families. Social media was also at the heart of providing hope, support, and even solutions for consumers far off. And no, I'm not plugging social media here, but it's the truth. Because there was a someone who would find out about someone else who could help the third someone to get, I don't know, advice, medicines, access to life saving care, and hopefully to actually save a life at the end of it all. So there's no argument that with this pandemic, there is a trust deficit and technology is actually coming in to fill the void. That I think should also help us understand why there is this huge energy and this force that's shaping the way we are connecting with each other and what we're consuming. Because one of the biggest challenges on technology today is what we spoke about, right? Misinformation and hate. And the fact remains that digital transformation is this great reset that's happening to civilization, so to speak. And there's absolutely no going back. So whether it's grandmothers ordering groceries online to children who are accessing education in far-flung areas, and that's certainly the case in a country like India, which is absolutely vital to their continued growth and development. There's no going back, and there's no way that we want to take that away. But equally, the nasties that come with it, and there's no other word for it, is what, as a business and as a brand, we have to confront every day. And we cannot step away from it. And I think both Jake and Jerry spoke about that. Because going digital means that the world is now flexing to a digital information first oriented culture, society, world, right? And therefore, its impact is all pervasive. It all depends, and the speed, my gosh, depends on the speed of the processor on your phone or the network that you have access to. But whichever way you look at it, information is spreading wider, it's spreading faster, and to many, many more people in a unique share model. It's about really talking to a market of one. It is one-on-one marketing. It's not just about the group. It's what I want to see. It's my unique, deafening, I would say, echo chamber, which we're all very well aware of, and probably we all inhabit as well. And in that echo chamber, can you imagine a world where consumers, customers, society, communities go directly, via this media, really to businesses and brands that they choose on this media platform? And what does it mean for a business or a brand that's been unwittingly caught between? And I think, we spoke about that earlier. Those algorithms, that positioning, that programmatic or contextual ad, which has absolutely no context to your brand or to your business. It is really a unique phenomenon. It's something that marketers, you spoke about my 20 plus years, which give away my age, but also tell you about the evolution that we have lived. I mean, there's nothing that prepared us for this, even as a brand or a business. So it is a unique phenomenon. I'm actually going to use a source of information, which is a 21st Global Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a study that was done in 27 countries. It's 21 years of this. It represents both informed digital consumers and also the general population. And it is supposed to represent, the population across these 27 countries, across the world, developing, developed, etc., with a focus on a certain number of countries. Now, the interesting thing, and this came out some time ago for the year 2020-21, media today is at a record low in terms of trust, whether it's search engines, traditional media, owned media, social media. So media, which was the purveyor of all information, is now recording the lowest trust ever that communities and people and society across the world, these are just average Joes across the world, who do not believe that media is fair. And guess who's coming back on top? And this was a surprise for me. This is something I'd never seen before. Ahead of institutions like media, like I spoke of, government and NGOs, business is sitting on top as the most trusted. And why? Because it's seen as both competent and ethical. And that might be a surprise to a number of people on the panel. But I think what this says is that businesses are being expected to step up to the ethical challenges in the vacuum that you're facing on trust in the world today. And that is such a revelation for, I think, businesses. And this goes beyond some of the ethics expected, right? Or some of the fair practices, which is transparency and accountability, fair payment, no child labor or forced labor, gender equity and representation, really, of genders, and respect for the environment. All of these are things that we know of. We know brands, we know businesses making that transformation. It has to be, it goes way beyond that. And we're not just talking about the symbolic stuff like showing that diversity exists, a rainbow of faces or breaking stereotypes. And I'm sorry, I'm being a little harsh maybe on my own community, because there's some classic, simple, let's do this and we can get away with it. We spoke about the fact that we can't always show women cooking or in the kitchen, or students always studying, or reinforcing inequities, really, especially for those voices that have less of a bargaining power. I mean, less bargaining power than maybe the rest. How we're represented in media, this goes way beyond that. It goes, and I think CAN does a phenomenal job of really putting out that manifesto. It goes about not about ad fraud. And remember, we're talking about a technology-enabled world. So in the context of technology, how do you get diverse media and diverse voices ahead? How do you empower the lowest denominator, not just the most powerful spender or the most powerful search engine? How do you have informed consent, really, for marketing, for those cookies, for for consumers, and the way their data is being used? How do you ensure that children's well-being is looked after? They are accessing the same devices. They're using it for education today. How do I ensure that there aren't the wrong kind of media pop-ups? And how do I ensure, most important, that misinformation is not being actively traded? And as a business, one could argue, why is that my job? Because I'm here to sell a brand. But it is because businesses are gaining trust the most by being the guardian of information quality. I'm again referring to the same study. A business has to guard information quality, otherwise consumers will stop trusting it. And it's no good to turn around and say, I didn't have control over the medium. So as a business owner, as a brand owner, as a marketer, as an advertiser, this is possibly the most important thing for you to invest on, to say, where are my ads being served? Who are they being served to? How are they being consumed? Let me give you an example. A few weeks ago, what came out in India was that influencers, and today an influencer is possibly the most powerful leader in the world. Global reach, unpredictable legions of fans, breaking language, country barriers. There's absolutely nothing that they can't overcome. So in an action that was more about self-governing advertisers, the Advertising Standards Council of India issued guidelines saying all sponsored influencer content had to be declared and labeled as such. This was ahead of the legislation in the government. Why? Because brand placements, product content integrations, all of that had to be flagged to a consumer, because it's not good enough to go out and say this is just content. This is misinformation. And if you ask me, that's just a very small measure. We're talking about hate speech. We're talking about getting your ads served, with Holocaust deniers. We're talking about people, who are taking words and meaning out of context and twisting it around, fake news, morphed images. You don't want to be seen with that, because as a business, you're going to lose trust in consumers, right? So ethical advertising and tackling information, I mean, today is not only it's a priority, it's something that's become more or less a mandate for an organization to put into their manifesto, is my point of view. We have to invest right. We have to engage with publishers on dialogues constantly on how to get better, because those algorithms are being served up. Encourage more and more advertisers to join the same as well. It's not good enough for a few large global companies to do it. It's about the small companies as well signing up. And finally, to be the change we want to see, which is one of my favorite sayings said by Mahatma Gandhi. Because, and that's certainly the way we see it at HMD Nokia, whether it's on saying that we're going to show authentic consumers, be honest about what we do, and about the way we use your data, where it's stored, and how we will not market without consent. And there's not a pitch for my business, but it's stripping away the filters. We spoke about it earlier, right? On age, image, beauty stereotypes, really, and putting them out there, and therefore being responsible for the kind of image issues that young kids have today. And being a brand in a business that represents the many, because we are all here to serve the many. We're not here to serve the few. And I think this is something I feel absolutely passionate that as an industry, we have the means, we have the intellect, and we certainly have the data to be able to make that change. So the question is, how do we do it? And forums like this are the ones where connecting with and putting out these opinions, I believe, is extremely important in this time and age. Thanks. I mean, that was really what I had to say. And I loved listening to what, of course, everyone else said. But I think this is a space that's evolving so fast that it's quite possible, Pia, we do this next week, And we're going to have a completely new set of data points and things that we absolutely need to cover. So yeah, thanks for this.
Thank you, Ruchira. I made a note. We'll do this next week then. No. Thank you very much. And as expected, thank you also for bringing the perspective, from down on the ground to say that it is about everybody in the ecosystem that is walking the talk, if you will. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And it was also interesting for me to hear about the role, the trust that is placed in business. We've always said here from the human rights or its HR side, that business has such an important public voice, and it has such an important public voice, particularly in regions such as ours, where the public voice of some governments is suspect, or that they don't fill the space that they should do in terms of a good governance perspective. And so we really do recognize and appreciate where you have business that wants to step into those roles and to say, we are a societal player and we have a role, a voice to make the society into the image that it should be. So thank you very much for giving us that really important perspective. And I think our next speaker, Ranji David, is going to take us further down that road as well, to give us a sense of what is possible and what has been done. So Ranji is the Asia Pacific Director of Marketing Services at the World Federation of Advertisers that we've heard of before. Ranji has over 20 years of experience across marketing capability, communications, and digital transformation, having worked with and consulted for a variety of consumer businesses, including Samsung and Audi, and was formerly the Executive Director of the IAB Southeast Asia. Ranji, I can't wait to hear what you have to say, so please, you have the floor. And I know you have some slides as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pia. To Jerry's point, there will be some overlap in what I'll share, but I think these issues aren't just business critical, they're human critical. And it's not a bad thing, I think, that we reinforce some of these points. Before I jump into the slides, we've talked a lot about the ills of advertising, but I think there is a mighty amount of good that can be done, and actually already has been initiated by advertisers to make marketing better, or as in our maxim at the World Federation of Advertisers, to drive better marketing. At the WFA, we wholeheartedly believe that advertisers can be part of the solution as trusted, responsible businesses. I love that Ruchira mentioned that glorious statistic from the Edelman Barometer. In some of these instances, you'll see, I'm really happy to say that advertisers not only have set the standards that need to be upheld as we uplift the industry, that we love, with a great opportunity to do good. And to that point, it is such an honor to represent the brand voice to this audience. Just going to check that we've connected on the slides. Perfect. Just going to go back. I think we are one slide ahead. There we go. All right. So this being a UN panel, it really only makes sense to start with a UN initiative, namely the hugely inspiring Unstereotype Alliance, convened by UN Women, and referenced by Jake a little bit earlier. So thanks for that, Jake. Some of you may already know about this incredible industry-led initiative convened by UN Women that was launched at Cannes in 2017 with the aim to unite industry leaders, decision makers, and creatives to end harmful gender stereotypes in advertising. The WFA is very proud to be a founding member. Jerry knows this well. GSK are also members. And that I think was the start for the journey for us, the WFA. And that was followed by making sure our slides are, there you go. Our journey really to drive diversity and inclusivity in advertising. We have the WFA task force that has convened just under 30 brands, agencies, NGOs, that has come together with the mission really to create and curate the knowledge and resources driven to drive measurable change. We helped set and challenge the global industry agenda, and the aim is to really catalyze national initiatives, drive that change locally so that diversity can thrive everywhere. We are so blessed to have Jerry Dakin as WFA Global Diversity Ambassador on this. And he's such a great voice for us. And really at a industry level, an individual level, this is something we all can come together. That Big Tent Pia mentioned, to really impact the change we want to see. The goal here for us is to develop tangible, actionable guidance that advertisers can not only be inspired by, but also really easily and effortlessly implement. So you're not going to be able to read the fine print across that diagram at the top right of the screen, but I think it's an excellent and easily applicable 12-step roadmap to help advertisers identify and then dismantle where bias can occur in the creative advertising process. It's just one of many guides we published. The first, as our commitment as a founding member of the Unstereotype Alliance, was a guide to progressive gender portrayals in advertising in the case for unstereotyping ads. We published this in 2018, and I'm so happy to say that since then, it's been translated from English into Spanish, Portuguese, and also Turkish. What's next? Maybe an Asian language, I hope. So I hope that's something we look to do. Next up, we have the Global Alliance for Responsible Media that both Jake and Jerry referenced. We have now, close to 100 members the world over in what's truly a really uncommon collaboration to improve digital safety. We have national advertiser and agency associations from IACA across Europe to the Malaysian Advertisers Association as part of GARM, as we reference it. We have TikTok and Twitch. There's Publicis Media as one of many media networks, P&G, Facebook, to Friesland Campina. The goals are simple and straightforward, and I won't go into all of that, but it really is about establishing shared universal safety standards. Jeremy talked about that for advertising and media. We want to improve and create common brand safety tools across the industry. It's about that common good, a shared agreement, a shared platform, a shared set of terms laws to come across, to all come together on, and mutual accountability and independent verification and oversight. So, in terms of our goals, it's really about bringing everyone together for the common good. It's not just about brands as well. We also engage with NGOs involved in civil society and safety with a focus on safe uses of media and tech. Ruchira talked about the tech bit, and that's something we definitely understand and appreciate. We have a core group of NGOs that we consult with at least once a quarter. And that ability to also consult the likes of Consumers International, Amnesty International, UNICEF, the Anti-Defamation League, the Journalism Trust Institute is important because of the wider perspective they bring to our work on the brand side. And I'm really proud to say that as of November 2019, GARM is a flagship project of the World Economic Forum platform for shaping the future of media, entertainment, and culture, and that's a responsibility we certainly don't take lightly. And then, we started with a great solution initiated by UN Women, and I'm happy to close with another initiative that looks at, inspired by the UN, and in particularly the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and how these are really a galvanizing force for advertisers. So the recently published WFA Marketing and Sustainability Research, this is developed in partnership with Project 17, the BVA Nudge Unit, informed by, I think, 680 or so marketers across 34 markets, including Asia Pacific. Nearly 80% of respondents, and these are senior marketers the world over, reported taking actions tied specifically to these goals. And among the 17 SDGs, the 4 most frequently cited were climate action, responsible consumption and production, gender equality, and good health and well-being. Ruchira spoke to the good work, done on the ground in India, well, at least during the recent COVID challenges. And I know during that, so many brands and so many of our members were significantly less focused on advertising and marketing campaigns per se, more focused on getting oxygen and medical and health support to their teams and their families. And to me, it goes back to the points made that advertisers can be part of the solution, whatever the solution looks like, towards making positive impact, positive change for people. On the back of that, we've launched the WFA Planet Pledge. It's a framework designed to help advertisers commit to the global race to zero. And the focus here is on scaling the accountability on marketing organizations. Jerry talked about the initiative GSK have to train, I think, close to 1,000 marketers and bring it up to speed. Education is so critical in these things to harness the power of marketing communications and really to reinforce a trustworthy marketing environment. Unilever, MasterCard, L'Oreal, Danone, Dole have signed up with more advertisers coming on board, and we certainly welcome more to join us in the journey. Because, you know, and I'll reference this that was said to me when I first joined the WFA, that if you want to go fast, you know, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. It's about partnerships. It's about alliances. It's about collectives. I am, you know, so proud to work for an organization that is pot committed to impacting and influence positive change. But I will, you know, be the first one to acknowledge that all these initiatives I've referenced aren't the only ones available to anyone in our business who wants to make marketing better. These don't belong to the WFA alone. You know, we have exceptional partners that I mentioned to walk the journey with. And to Pia's point, it's about partnerships, right? Where the whole really is greater than the sum of its parts. And that can certainly be said about Asia. You know, we are in a region with diversity baked in. One country's majority race or religion is another's minority, and being sensitive to that, you know, the solution, I think, really in this part of the world is to be hyper local. You know, the macro issues are global, universal, but you know, to an extent. But to make a real impact, we need to do that in micro level. And for that, I am very grateful for an association, an network of national advertisers associations in Asia. You know, in addition to associations from Pakistan to the Philippines, India to Indonesia, one of our members is the Association of New Zealand Advertisers. Jake referenced the terrorist attacks in New Zealand, and when that happened, they took on the role of rallying their members to take a stand, withholding investment on the social platforms until the appropriate safeguards were put in place to prevent the broadcast of diabolical content, you know, from being broadcast live. And they spoke to us about it. We were more than happy to stand in allegiance with them. And we look to these associations to help us understand the new local nuances and to co-author the best approach to take at the ground level, because it's important, you know, clearly that with inclusivity, it mustn't be about imposition, and where we can co-author, why not? So, you know, this certainly isn't the one end goal where we can say, okay, that's the goal and job done. We're set for forever. This is a dynamic process. It's a constantly evolving journey. There is no great marketing. This is an iterative process. Where as long as we're all committed, I think, to a shared vision of what better looks like, advertising will be okay, and we all get to be part of the change towards better marketing. So happy to do this with everybody, and we welcome all voices into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ranji, and thank you, as I suspected you would do, of uplifting us as well, by, you know, really kind of giving us concrete examples of where coming together has made a difference, and where you've seen advertisers take a stand, and you know, kind of unusual partnerships and unusual alliances really kind of have resulted in the kind of action that we'd like to see. So thank you very much, because I think that's been really important in this discussion. It could be easy to get too caught up in the challenges and in the complexity of the whole thing, and so it's really great to have these different perspectives. And on that note, I'd like to end our panel, last but definitely not least, with a perspective from civil society that is very used to kind of operating in a space where there are so many grey areas in terms of some of the issues we've been talking about. Freedom of expression, how you defund, who do you defund, what is the good stuff, how do you, you know, kind of continue to uplift it. So I'd like to welcome Caroline Silver, who is Program Manager for Asia, Article 19. Caroline joined Article 19's Asia Pacific program in January 2019, where she contributes to a range of work in the region to promote the right to freedom of expression. Caroline has worked in human rights law and refugee law for several years and was a law clerk at the Constitutional Court of South Africa. Caroline, it's a real pleasure to have you. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Pia, and thanks to all of the panelists who came before me. I'm in the privileged position of being last, so I will pick up on some of the points that were made by other colleagues, because I do think we're very much on the same page about a lot of what we're talking about today. But just to give you, first of all, a brief introduction to Article 19, we're an organization that works globally to protect the right to freedom of expression. And so that means we work on a range of topics, from media freedom to digital rights, transparency, civic space, and also hate speech. And sometimes people are surprised about, why are we working on hate speech? Aren't hate speech and freedom of expression sort of the opposite of one another? But I want to make clear that for us, freedom of expression means having an enabling environment for expression. It means having diverse voices that are able to participate in discussions. And for that reason, hate speech and also disinformation can be very exclusionary and can actually degrade the right to freedom of expression. And so we do a lot of work on hate speech. It's a very important issue for us. And some of you may be familiar with our hate speech toolkit. If you aren't, I would encourage you to look it up. It's on our website, it's online, it's been translated into many languages. But it does lay out some of the international standards that do exist around tackling hate speech, and how to, as you mentioned, Pia, how to address hate speech while protecting all relevant human rights. And some of the most relevant standards there are the Rabat Plan of Action, Human Rights Council Resolution 1618, on combating intolerance and discrimination. And what's clear from those international standards is that state regulation is absolutely not enough. And we have many examples, including from the Asia Pacific region, where legislation that's purportedly designed to combat hate speech is actually selectively deployed against religious and ethnic minorities. And then we can see a similar dynamic with disinformation. With the COVID pandemic, we've seen so many new legal measures trying to combat fake news, so-called fake news. And that ends up, many cases, being deployed against journalists who might be promoting a narrative that the government doesn't like. And so regulation is not the only answer. Those international standards that I mentioned before, they already envision a whole of society approach. That means that we all have a role to play in combating hatred and combating disinformation, and certainly advertisers have such an important place in this conversation. And we see it, we see engaging with advertisers as really such an important opportunity to address really a range of issues. First of all, I want to make the point that I think Jerry was sort of making this point earlier, which is that it's not only about sort of defunding bad outlets. It's about inclusion. It's about promoting the good actors. And really, it's also an opportunity to promote media sustainability in the region. And second, just the topic of partnerships, which again has been mentioned by so many panelists already today, but I do really want to encourage partnerships, especially with civil society. So one way that Article 19 has been trying to understand this issue is with how we leverage advertising budgets to improve reporting standards. And again, this isn't about taking money away from media, but it's about using the leverage that advertisers have to engage in conversations about things like reporting standards. Ranji mentioned the Journalism Trust Initiative, for example, which is sort of a global initiative, but there are other initiatives, at a more local level that could be drawn upon to promote, to increase and improve standards. And then at the same time, we know that there are really great local independent media outlets that are doing phenomenal work and are struggling to survive. Can we form partnerships where recognizing that they're actually, in many cases, promoting the tolerance and the inclusion that we want to see in this world? Can we form partnerships to specifically ensure that they that they get an adequate look as well? I think, the issue of online advertising came up a number of times, and this sort of takes me to some of the challenges. I think with online advertising, it was mentioned that just the scale is so massive. And I think some of the similar problems that we see with large scale content moderation, you're probably seeing with trying to deal with the volume of online content advertising, where just a keyword, as Jerry mentioned, that's not really getting to the level of granularity that you need to know whether this advertising is good or bad. So just to provide a note of where we are as an organization on this topic, we and others do a lot of work to engage with media. So freelancers, staff journalists, editors who are eager for resources and tools to learn about how their reporting can contribute to tolerance and inclusion. And we've been exploring how these approaches could also be aligned with the work of those interested in ethical advertising. So I think, we're still at very early stages, but we would love to keep this conversation going with those on the panel, but those also who might be watching in the audience. So please feel free to get in touch with us if you're interested in continuing this conversation. But I think, again, the partnership aspect is so crucial. There isn't one universal standard across the region. As Ranji mentioned, there's so much diversity, but there are local initiatives in place, and civil society groups, I think, have a great understanding of the context of hatred and disinformation, and also they have existing partnerships. Ruchira mentioned the power of influencers. There are a lot of partnerships between civil society and influencers as well. So I think just connecting all of those dots and really seeing how we can work together to, concretely say add more, good independent media to the good list, to the yes, we want to fund these outlets list, or having that nuanced conversation about, well, what does hatred and discrimination look like in my context, is really important. And I think, I'm not only trying to say that, civil society is important for advertisers, but vice versa. I mean, I think you have so many tools and skills that can be really useful in our work as well. I mean, you understand markets and ideas so well, and I think there's just so much opportunity for exchange there. So I'll end on that note, just with a note about, hoping that we can keep this conversation going. We already have a meeting set for next week, I've heard, so maybe in a few weeks' time after that. But yes, thank you so much for organizing this, Pia and Jake, and I hope to keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And thank you again also for really drawing our attention to the context where we have local media, we have local grassroots and community-based civil society organizations that, as Jake said right at the beginning, are the ones that can provide you that context. So who can tell you what the situation is on the ground? As the special rapporteur said, you know, what is the problem? How do we kind of address the exclusion? So thank you very much for that. We've got 5 minutes before we have to finish, and I have a couple of questions that I'm going to throw out and ask one of you to, or some of you to address them. The first is from Harriet Kingerby, who is in fact Jake's co-chair or at the Conscious Advertising Network, and she asks a very important question, which is, how can models such as the Conscious Advertising Network be best adapted to Asia and the Pacific to support the work that we've heard is already ongoing? You know, what do we need to do? The second question that we have is from my colleague, Geneviève Sarvoli, that some of you know from OHCHR in Geneva. And she asks, is there a good way to confront the way that the algorithms work? Is there a good way to put in place an economics of inclusion to combat the economics of hate? So I will throw that out there for you. I don't know, Jake, if you wanted to respond to Harriet, or if there's Ruchira Oranji from the region who wanted to speak to, you know, how the CAN model might be adapted to here. And I don't know who wants to take on the
I think I'll pass. I'll pass straight on to Ruchir and Ranji, because I think it's really important that everybody's talked about partnership and how you replicate things that work in our region is really by deeply partnering with civil society groups and businesses and experts within the region to craft the solution locally rather than sort of globally, but aligned to the same sort of principles. So over to Ruchir and Ranji.
Sure. Ranji, Ruchira, you both
love the way, you know, I just absolutely love the way Jake's put us on the mat on this one. But thank you for that. Because, and thank you for that in terms of, because it's a great question. First of all, we work with agency partners who are part of CAN. And that for us is it's a testimony to saying, we will not partner with you unless you understand that we want to actively be a part of the dialogue on combating misinformation, hate, and finding ways to make our brands and our business appear in line with the values, the mission, the purposes that we stand for. So I think that's one thing that is very important. Equally, as a business, it may be part of your manifesto and your mission. But can we, for example, work with, I don't know, workshop with our young teams who are coming in with energy, with diverse views, and workshop with them and with organizations like CAN and say, hey, you know what? This is ways to think of what you may be passing out unconsciously, the biases that we all carry, right? How do you consciously address it? And I think it's something that comes over a dialogue, it comes over conversations, and frankly, this is where technology can help us. We all don't need to be in the same room, but it can be part of a conversation that becomes a really engaged way of bringing this alive. So for me, and I won't take more time than I could pass it on to Ranji as well, because she can share from across the region. For me, I think it's very, like a typical business person, I think there are very, very concrete and very clear steps that we can take to make it come alive, not just what we've done in the past, but equally ahead. Ranji, what do you think?
Thanks, Ruchira. I think for us, you know, what we've done to do this across the APAC is really listen to and bring our National Advertiser Associations members into the conversation. So across 8 different countries, from China through to Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, we've started to bring them into global surveys, you know, more aggressively, bring their members into it, understand what the local nuances are, so really to listen, and then together with them co-author the right solution. It's got to be hyper-local. It's got to really make a difference at a ground level. You know, we wouldn't do it at the global level, even at a regional level. We're such a diverse region. I can't imagine to speak on behalf of the Filipino brands and members. I'm half Chinese and half Indian. I wouldn't even dare speak to what our members in China want, or what you know. you and your teams in India would feel most relevant. So we're learning to listen more, we're learning to co-author, and together really then identify the solutions.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Ranji. That both really, really important and excellent points. Is anybody feeling brave enough to tackle the issue of algorithms in 1 minute? Jerry or Jake?
Well, I think it's a big one. The answer to that is that you don't tackle it in 1 minute because they're not simple to tackle. But I think conversations like this, the work that the WFA and GARM is doing, the work that CAN is doing, we have. I think the WFA has some really good sort of top level conversations with the very senior leadership of Google, Facebook, and those companies. CAN, we've had some really amazing forums where we bring a lot of the NGO organisations together for some quite blunt and hard hitting reality checks about how some of their algorithms are landing in reality. And I think that two-pronged attack or approach cooperation is helping move things forward. It's not simple. Even when humans get asked to make some of the decisions that algorithms are making, we don't always know which way different humans would disagree. But I think the industry has to keep putting pressure on when things go wrong. Advertisers choosing to move their money, to pause their spends, to put that on is an important part of the dynamic. I think that the big platforms mentioned are not perfect, but I do see them trying to get better, and I think we need to keep chasing them on that and challenging them on that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for stepping in. We've come to the end of our time here, and I just really, really like to thank you all for what I thought was a fascinating conversation. It's clearly a conversation that we need to have again. So if you're all up for it, we'd love to bring us all together, bring some of the local advertising partners together and continue speaking, because I think the one thread that we've had through this discussion is that multi-stakeholder partnerships, these kinds of talking across our different worlds is really important. So I'd like to thank, first of all, the Special Rapporteur, who unfortunately had to leave us early for an inspiring start, and to Jerry, to Jake, to Ruchira, Ranji, and Caroline for really a fascinating discussion. Good evening, good afternoon, and I hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.